In this lesson, we'll talk about application services layer, which I introduced back in lesson number 6 when I first introduced the domain layer. We saw how the Microsoft Application Architecture Guide calls this the application facade layer, which it denotes as a sublayer of the business logic layer, what we call the domain layer. The purpose of the application services layer is to keep the presentation layer and the domain layer separated and to provide a higher level set of methods to the presentation layer. Let me explain the rationale behind this. We have two seemingly conflicting goals. On the one hand, we want to keep the presentation layer from knowing too much about the domain layer. If the presentation layer knows too much about how the domain layer does its job, then it could be accused of overstepping its delegated responsibilities, and that would be bad. You'll see this in just a moment. On the other hand, in the domain layer, we want to create small, laser-focused, cohesive methods and classes. Cohesion is important in object-oriented programming. A small, cohesive method abides by the single responsibility principle, and it's more likely to abide by the dry or don't repeat yourself principle as well. And as we're delegating responsibilities to classes, it's easier to know where a given responsibility should be delegated if each class and each method has a clearly identifiable role in the layer. In object-oriented programming, small, cohesive classes work together to solve a problem, and they're preferable to large, bulky methods and classes that try to do too much. These small, cohesive classes and methods are composed together to solve a problem and can be reused to solve other problems because ultimately they know how to solve one small piece of the puzzle and they're atomic and independent enough to be reused in different capacities. This laser focus makes them very reusable, very unit testable, and very understandable. It makes their value very obvious. Robert Martin goes as far to say that 4, 5, or 6 lines of code in a method is okay. Any more than that, and you might need to seriously consider refactoring that method into something smaller. That might come as a shock to the system if you come from a procedural programming background, but this is meant to simplify development and make your code more readable, more testable, and more composable or orchestratable. All right? But the problem with creating many smaller, laser-focused, cohesive methods and classes in the domain layer is that the presentation layer now is forced to know a lot about which classes and methods to call inside of the domain layer in order to orchestrate the operations it needs to be performed. So in other words, to create an order, the presentation layer may need to know which methods and classes across many different classes and many different methods in order to solve this single business problem, creating an order. In fact, there's a sense in which this orchestration is really a domain concern, not a presentation concern. But the presentation needs something to call. So to solve this problem, we introduce another layer. Its job is to coordinate and orchestrate the lower level classes and method calls in the domain layer to solve specific problems. And that's why we introduce this application services layer, also known as the application facade layer, and probably is known by other names as well, but something between this domain and the presentation layers. The presence of an application services layer prevents another layer like the presentation layer from knowing too much about how the domain layer does its work. Because after all, if the presentation layer has too much knowledge about the domain layer, then if we were to need to implement a second and subsequent presentation layer, one for the web, one for the desktop, one for the iPhone, and so on, we'd have to duplicate that orchestration knowledge of the domain layer in each implementation, leading to potentially different implementations of the business rules if we're not careful. We may leave something important out or add something in inadvertently. The application services layer helps to mitigate this by rolling up all the lower level functionality into a higher level set of methods that can be called by other layers, like the presentation layer, or as we'll learn about in the next lesson, a web services layer. As I noted, the Microsoft Application Architecture Guide uses the term application facade, and a facade is often used in software design parlance. It simply means a thin layer that covers something else. it's a pretty face that covers the down and dirty details. In this context, an application facade presents a pretty simple interface, a single method call maybe. And behind the scenes, it'll be doing all the dirty work required to provide the layer that it's serving, most likely the presentation layer or perhaps a web service layer. I use the term higher level. I may also describe the methods in the application facade, or rather the application services layer as I've been calling it, as chunky methods or coarse-grained methods. These are all terms that essentially describe the same thing, a single method that calls other methods in an effort to ultimately aggregate a set of data to return to the client for display, or coordinate the methods that are required to change underlying data in the application, apply business logic, business rules as necessary, and so on. Again, the higher level, chunky, coarse-grained methods rely on the lower level, chatty, finer-grained methods. These methods are the ones we talked about a moment ago. They are the workflow and entity methods that encapsulate the business rules and logic and have a single laser focus and are highly cohesive, unit testable, and the like. So the application services layer coordinates, it orchestrates. The domain layer classes and the methods actually do all the heavy lifting. The domain layer classes are like construction workers. Each one specializes in a different task. The application services layer is like the foreman who coordinates and orchestrates their activities in order to build something larger that any single one of them was capable of. Some business process like create and order, which might involve dozens of classes and dozens of methods as well. So how do you implement the application services layer? Is it okay to couple it to the domain layer? So in other words, can I create instances of classes in the domain layer, or do I have to go through some roundabout way of doing that? Well, for the most part, I think it's just fine. You can go ahead and create instances of classes in the domain layer and not feel guilty about it. It's okay to couple it, to make a dependency of the application services layer to the domain services layer. After all, it's really part of the domain. It coordinates the lower level activities of the domain into higher level activities. In fact, if you remember in the Microsoft Application Architecture Guide, it puts that application facade layer as a sub-layer of the domain layer. So what we're calling the application services layer, it would put this as just a part or a sub-layer of the higher level domain layer. We don't care that these two layers are tightly coupled. Or maybe I should say it this way. I'm not offended that the application services layer creates instances of classes in the domain layer. Now, truth be told, I might not see the point of the other way around, where a domain layer class or method creates instances of the higher level methods. That may not make as much sense to me. There might be different ways to compose or orchestrate or coordinate the lower level domain methods in the future for different application types. But if I were to couple my domain classes and methods to higher level methods, then now I've kind of prevented that from happening. I prevented us from reusing those domain level classes, those finer grained chatty classes and methods in different types of applications. So it doesn't feel necessary. It feels kind of maybe that dependency is pointed in the wrong direction. I would keep the dependency pointed from the higher level application services down into and create instances of classes here, not the other way around. All right, this will become more evident once we get our hands dirty in some code. And I realize we're still talking here at a high level. You're going to want to see a working example at some point. I get it. We're going to get to that point. For now, just understand that the intent of this layer, the application services layer, is to provide higher level, chunky methods that orchestrate and coordinate the activities of the lower level chatty methods that really do the hard work, that perform the real work and ultimately make calls into the persistence layer classes that are injected in, like we talked about in the previous lessons. The application services layer solves the problem of the presentation layer knowing too much about the implementation of the domain layer. With an application services layer in place, all it needs to know is the name of a single method and all those sub-activities activities happen behind the scenes. They're all encapsulated behind that single method that the presentation layer calls into the application services layer. Now, when implementing a second or subsequent presentation layer, there are fewer calls to make, right? So less domain knowledge to implement in the presentation layer means it'll be easier to create new presentation layer implementations. All right, we'll see this chatty versus chunky at work when we talk about web services layer as well as the next lesson. And anytime we want to communicate between layers that could potentially be deployed to different tiers. We'll want to reduce the chatter to improve performance for remotely distributed objects and services. We'll learn more about that in the next lesson or two. So we'll see you there. Thank you.